All right. Hello, everybody. So welcome to this conversation that we'll be having with Dr. Jeff Rutherford. I am Dr. Jan Mann, the program lead for the World War II Studies master's degree program at Arizona State University, which we offer in collaboration and cooperation with the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. And so today we are going to have a long-ranging discussion about a recent edited volume that Dr. Rutherford put out. And Dr. Rutherford's background, quick introduction, he is a teaching professor of history at Xavier University. He's a specialist on the German Army, and his publications include Combat and Genocide on the Eastern Front, the German Infantry's War, 1941 through 1944, published with Cambridge in 2014. He is co-author of The German Army on the Eastern Front, an inner view of the Ostheer's experiences of war with pen and sword in 2018, co-editor of Nazi Policy on the Eastern Front, Total War, Genocide, and Radicalization with Rochester in 2012, and now co-author of the volume we'll be discussing today, The German-Soviet War, Combat, Occupation, and Legacies with Cornell in 2025. Finally, he is currently working on a history of the German army in the Second World War for Cambridge University Press. So thank you so much for joining us and having this conversation. And first place I want to start is background for this volume, right? I know when putting together my own volume, which we were kind enough to contribute a chapter to, this was something I was approached about, initially turned down, and then decided to rethink as long as I could find some additional help in terms of co-editors. And so I'm wondering, were you approached for this volume, or was this your idea? How did this manifest initially?
No, I was approached for it by Robert von Meyer, my co-editor. Robert had was the editor of Global War Studies, which was a journal dedicated to the study of the Second World War. And I had attended a conference that he had put on in Sandhurst in the UK. It was a huge Second World War conference, and yeah, we hit it off. And a couple years later, he asked if I'd be interested in working on some sort of volume about the German-Soviet War. He had been moving away from the journal into books and had worked as a co-editor on a couple other, and he had served as um, kind of the stylist, the editor of various manuscript or monographs that were published as well. So he had been moving in this direction. He contacted me and said, he thought it was time for a volume on the German-Soviet War. There was a lot of new work that had been coming out, and he had a few people in mind that he thought could contribute. And yeah, I said yes. Sometimes you regret these decisions early on in the process, but it all worked out as we went forward.
So thinking, when did the idea for the volume first come about? And how long was this process in total? I know, again, with my own volume, I think it was around 2022, 2023, but the total time from start to publication was around 2-ish years.
Yeah, you're a sprinter compared to me, more of a marathon guy. This process started in 2019. We had, he contacted me. I put out some feelers to people I knew who were working on stuff to see if they'd be interested. We made some progress, and then COVID hit. And once COVID hit, this had all sorts of effects. People who we thought might be able to contribute couldn't, for various reasons. The press that we thought was a possibility, a very strong possibility, went through all sorts of cuts. So COVID and its related issues severely lengthened the process of publication. Now, there were some benefits in that it allowed us to broaden the scope of the book. And, people who I was unaware of in 2019, by 2023, 24, yeah, I'm aware, and so it was beneficial in that respect, in that we added some very good contributors a couple years into the process.
So
But as I like to send out to all the contributors, that this book took longer to finish than the war itself did.
that is
Yeah.
true. So that brings up the follow-up question that I had, which is, was the central thread always combat, occupation, and legacies, as the subtitle is, or were there some transformations, evolutions in what the actual scope and subtopics for this volume would be?
Yeah, that was not there was no really guiding cohesive thread to it when I started. It was who's working on the German-Soviet War, who has something new and interesting to say. And these things kind of sort themselves out as you go along. I did the readers, the two readers that we had for Cornell provided really good feedback on ways to think about structuring the book that I think proved really beneficial in the end. So I am a military historian. I'm also very interested in occupation, but it's through the Army, so military stuff. But I still think that operational history has a value, and some of the contributors that we have are flat out military historians. So combat was always going to be there. Occupation to me is very important, and that's how you really understand what the German-Soviet War was about. The legacies part kind of evolved naturally, and it was based on several of the contributors who were looking at the war in a different and interesting way. So it seemed like a way to organize the volume was to look at it through those three subheadings.
Yeah, understandable. Our volume went through a few iterations, and as a result of losing contributors, we had to somewhat scramble to rethink what we really were able to cover so that we wouldn't be attacked, that there is not enough of, in this case, in our case, honestly, I think genocide. We lost genocide in the process. So war, myth, and memory turned out to be what we could cover with the contributors that we had. And so you already kind of mentioned that you lost contributors throughout the process. Do you recall how many you started with, how many you lost, how many you had to scramble to find, maybe not last minute, but through this process as well? And were there any pieces that you rejected for any reason? Again, in our case, there was someone who contributed a rather weak chapter that we could not take and did not have enough time to actually go through that editing process that would have been needed to bring it up to an acceptable standard.
Well, with our lengthy process, we had the time. There were all the chapters that were turned in, I thought were quite good. Robert read through them, agreed. There was one or two that could be strengthened, and that's the beauty of this process, is that everyone, theoretically, the editors, the press, the peer reviewers, we're all working, and obviously the chapter authors, we're all working to turn out the best possible product. So, we had one or two that required significant revision, including the introduction that I wrote, and yeah, it was worth it in the end. So no issues in that respect. There was two contributors who I thought we had. COVID interrupted with one of them, and another one had family stuff that came up, and family is more important than a book chapter. So no harm, no foul, and we just moved on. So yeah, we had a very stable core early on, and we were able to add as we went without too many difficulties. Now, there were several people that I contacted who couldn't do it for one reason or another, which is kind of the nature of the beast, I think, with edited volumes, unless you do a call for papers or something like that. And we wanted to be a little bit more intentional with how we approach the volume, so we didn't want to go for the call for papers route.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I can share one of the contributors that we were supposed to have, who was a big name in Soviet history, World War II history, who was located in Russia after 22, February of 22, when the war
Mhm.
restarted in some ways. Um, he had to move out of the country, as far as I can
Okay.
understand. And so that really put a bit of an obstacle in the path of trying to contribute a chapter to
Sure.
my small volume.
Yeah, yeah. No, real life takes precedent every time.
So
It's
that was fully understandable that we had zero issues with that. Now, so coming to the actual contents of this uh, edited volume, one thread that we see running through the chapters, at least I noticed, was this emphasis on ethnicities and nationalities in certain situations that do not usually garner the attention of readers or even specialists at times. And so, again, coming back to some earlier questions, is this a byproduct or was this one of the main ideas of this volume?
it was not a main idea when I set out.
Hmm.
When Robert and I were talking about what we wanted the volume to be. But as I started contacting people that I had, met through conferences or at various institutions or who I knew in various ways, what I found was that a lot of them are working on stuff that's not necessarily German and not necessarily Soviet, but things that had to do with the German-Soviet War. And so that section on this kind of internationalization of war kind of came about organically, and I was really happy it did. Yeah, I think it's a topic that's not as certainly not as well known as, say, Barbarossa or the Battle of Stalingrad or the Siege of Leningrad. Um, Nick Virtue's chapter on Italian troops, right? He looks at 1941. We know a fair amount about 42 when they're in the Stalingrad operation. We don't know as much about 41. So this, I thought, really churned up some new ground and really kind of broadened our understanding of Barbarossa as this war of annihilation. Same thing with Dallas Michelbacher's chapter on Romanian treatment of Soviet POWs. It worked really well for two reasons. One, we have two other chapters on the treatment of POWs, so you can see how different countries treat different POWs. And two, there's been some really good work recently on Romania waging its own type of war of annihilation. But Dallas shows they don't do it the entire way that the Germans do, right? That there are differences in the way these countries approach the war. Um, and then the chapter on Luxembourg conscripts, the Volksdeutsche, who don't consider themselves German, but all of a sudden are. And there just isn't a lot in English on Luxembourg soldiers serving in the German Wehrmacht in the East and how they understood it. And then from the Soviet side, right, we had the chapter on Polish troops, the Polish army raised to fight alongside the Red Army. Again, I think this is an issue that's discussed pretty extensively in Polish historiography. It's not one that there's a lot in English on. So the last chapter in this section looked at Lend-Lease, which has become, I think, an increasingly important way in which historians understand the Eastern Front. We've gone from the Western Allies win the war on their own to in the 90s, it's the Red Army that does all the work. And now we start to see, well, they work together in a lot of ways. And that chapter does a really good job showing the importance of Lend-Lease and the air battles in 1944. So yeah, I was super happy with that section because I think it does expand the way we should think about the war. The Germans and the Soviets are obviously the two behemoths involved, but they do represent these two different ideologies that we see all across Europe. And, there's been a lot of work that looks at, the Second World War as a civil war in a sense between fascism, democracy, and Bolshevism. And I think those chapters show how these ideas filter into different countries, right? It's not just the Germans, it's not just the Soviets, but we have to look at how other countries, especially Axis satellites, understand this war.
Yeah, those were without a doubt some of the more interesting chapters, at least for me, who has been reading on this topic for decades now, but still finding new and interesting and relevant information. The chapter on the Polish army I found absolutely thrilling in some ways because I know during the process of the war, you have two, well, one, you have a Polish army that's built up and then leaves, to
Hmm.
join the Allies in other theaters. But then you have over time two additional Polish armies fighting with the Red Army, and you
Yeah.
always see some glimpses of them here and there, partly participating in the Warsaw Uprising in a very kind of minor way, but still significant, at least to themselves.
Hmm.
But the vast majority of the history that's relayed in this chapter, I just had no clue about. And similarly, I think there are some of these trends that you are identifying that are also in parallel evident on the Soviet side of things. And in part, it's a result of, again, the recent invasion of Ukraine or re-invasion of Ukraine, in that scholars are not really able to work in former Soviet, now Russian government archives. And so the focus is now switching to the periphery. So you have a
Hmm.
lot more studies from Central Asia. You have a lot more studies from Ukraine, the Baltics. And so, and it's needed in some ways, absolutely. But I can see a parallel with the Axis, because on neither side were they alone, as you so well put, right? This is a quote unquote European effort on the part of the Third Reich. And on the part of the Soviet Union, you've got dozens of nationalities participating in the war, many of whom we just subsume under the Soviet moniker, and we rarely hear detailed examinations and discussions about. And so I thought that was easily one of the biggest strengths of this volume that I was very much impressed with and surprised pleasantly.
Yeah.
That.
Yeah, it was yeah, you think about the way that the Germans always refer to the Soviets, and it's just the Russian, right? It's always the Russian as singular, with no differentiation of all the various peoples fighting within the Red Army, and that this, in a way, works itself into the historiography. I think so much of early historiography about the war is determined by German memoir literature and the tropes and the stereotypes and the ways that they talk about the war really determines the way we think about the war for a long time. And if you flip that on the other side, whenever the Germans talk about Romanians or Italians, it's because they see them as making fatal errors or screwing up. And the chapters in this book kind of restore an agency and an individuality to how they approach the war, not just satellites of the Germans, but doing their own thing for their own reasons. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've recently seen some parallel when it comes to the Romanians and the Holocaust.
Hmm.
So some parallel kind of histories. And so this somewhat brings us to the next question that I had for you, which so there's been some recent literature on the importance of the myth of Judeo-Bolshevism to the Nazi war against the Soviet Union. How does this volume contribute to our understanding of this essential aspect of Nazism's ultra-racism?
Yeah, I think this book attacks this or looks at this idea in two ways. One, when you get into the section on the internationalization of the war, you see that the Italian army is selling this notion in a sense to its soldiers. Um, that the Romanian army is doing the same thing. Luxembourg troops who have no idea about the Soviet Union or what's going on, they're getting this idea. So this certainly is part of the way that the war is sold to German allies or Volksdeutsche, ethnic Germans who are put into the German army. You see the Ed Westerman's chapter on the Holocaust in Latvia. Clearly, this is an attack on Judeo-Bolshevism from the Nazi viewpoint. What I do think the book um, does, however, is it it maybe shifts emphasis away from looking at things from a purely ideological view and focuses on economics as a driver. Now, in many ways, these two things go together. That the predatory and rapacious German economic policies in the East, they are predicated on the idea that the Germans are racially superior, and this ties into Judeo-Bolshevism. Like all this is tied together. We don't see similar German economic policies in the West because there's a different view on the racial value of Western Europeans. So I do think this is, I think it's kind of a necessary shift. I mean, recent work has almost focused almost exclusively on ideology in a lot of ways and driving Nazi policy. And clearly, ideology is a major driver at the upper levels. But the further you get or the closer you get to the ground, the further down the hierarchy that you get, at least from what I found looking at the German army, is that the ideological sheen that's very apparent in 1941 starts to disappear. And you see much more emphasis on pragmatic issues, particularly economic issues, right? Where's the food coming from? Who's going to harvest it? How are we going to control the people in this area to make sure they do the work? Again, all based on an ideological foundation. But I think the book does get at this idea that economic thinking drives a lot of what the Germans are trying to do in this war.
So you've touched from the last two questions a little bit on the next question that I want to ask. So I'm going to add a little something to it, which is
Sure.
again this section on the internationalization of the Eastern Front. You have viewpoints, as you mentioned, from the Italians, Luxembourg, uh, Romanians. Do you think, and this is especially during Operation Barbarossa, you've got some evidence from coming through from that period. Do you think this puts into question what I would say is something of a myth about the German army as this well-oiled machine, just going from victory to victory to victory in 1941? When you start looking at the actual units that are participating, and from day one, you've got Romanian units, granted, you have Finnish units, and soon enough joined by Italian, Hungarian, Spanish Blue Division, Croatian Legion. You've got Ukrainian nationalists participating one another. So this is a very much an international effort.
Hmm.
But when you're looking at the larger histories of the Eastern Front, again, all of that gets subsumed under the German Wehrmacht. They blame all their issues on their allies. It's them who undermined our war effort. We were victorious up until Hitler started dictating orders, and these allies let us down. So now, thinking about these chapters, right? Does this contribute to a more nuanced understanding of both 1941 and the Eastern Front in general, that there were numerous issues with this invasion of the Soviet Union as it progresses from year to year?
Yeah, for sure. Um, that these help show the various problems that the German army faced. They highlight the problems it faced in terms of coalition warfare, difficulties in logistics, that the Germans are responsible in some ways for supplying all of these units that are going to be involved in the fight. And what becomes very clear is that if German units are poorly supplied, their allies are much more poorly supplied. And yeah, it's hard to for the Germans to sit there and blame the Italians or Romanians or whoever for poor military performance when they haven't been given the necessary goods that they need, and these have to come from Germany. So yeah, I do think that those chapters do a good job of um, showing that this is much more than just a German blitzkrieg, which I think is what we have in the popular image, right? And kind of what you were hinting at here, this idea that German tank armies go from victory to victory in 1941. And of course, there's some truth to that. The Germans do win massive victories all across 1941. But in the process, they suffer horrendous casualties. They see that their weapons, particularly the Panzer divisions, suffer huge losses that are very difficult to make good. And this notion of the Blitzkrieg army kind of ignores logistics, right? Oh, horses have to bring these things to the front, or the train gauges, or the rail gauges are different. All of these issues are kind of wiped away in this popular view. So I do think by looking at Italian troops or Luxembourg soldiers or Romanian soldiers, that this helps highlight the various issues that faced the Germans in 1941, in particular.
I mean, in some ways, you give them some, or you can give them some credit for keeping this coalition together, be it through ideology, be it through ideas of vengeance or revenge.
Mhm.
Even though there is infighting throughout, as we know, especially between Hungarians and Romanians.
Right.
And it only gets that much worse as they rely more and more on their allies from 41 into 42. But still, I think keeping the other side of the coin in mind is also just as important. And so leading us into the next question, are there any parts of the Eastern Front that you wanted this volume to address that for whatever reason you were not able to, right? Any subject, any topic, any event, any personality that you would have loved a chapter or two on, but for whatever reason didn't work out?
Um, uh, I was very hopeful for a chapter on partisan activity, be it either the German um, reaction to it or the Soviet policy. And we had a couple folks who one was lined up, couldn't do it. A couple others who were busy with other projects and couldn't fit it in. Um, I think what makes the German-Soviet War so interesting from a historical perspective is the totality of it. That it's a war that's fought differently than the Germans fight against the French, the British, the Americans, whoever. And that part of this is that war that the Germans wage against the civilian population, and then the civilians respond in many ways. And of course, this is, there's centralization here on Moscow's part to make the partisan effort, bring it under its control. But there is this popular aspect that gives the war a real ferocity as German soldiers don't feel safe in the rear, and Soviet civilians under German occupation can't feel safe ever from German reprisals or possible reprisals, potential reprisals. So I would have liked to have something on that. I think that would have helped round out the volume. So that was the big miss, I think.
I've, in my own research, I think one of the things I've recently discovered when it comes specifically to the partisan war is there was a lot of tension between the partisans in Belarusia and Ukraine. And
Mm,
you don't see too much of it. You see instances if you're reading partisan memoirs or some of these larger histories of partisan movements because they're somewhat embedded either again in Ukraine or Belarusia, and there's not as much crossover. And it really was a battle when you think about the rail war, for example. I've come across this evidence with specifically Ilya Stadinov, who was a famous saboteur from the Russian Civil War through the Spanish Civil War, through the war against Finland, the Winter War, and then into World War II. He was
okay.
present in all of these. And he helped actually set the mines in Kiev before they retreated,
Okay.
which eventually leads to the mass execution of Babi Yar, or gives them an excuse for it.
Right.
And one of his huge complaints about the partisan war is that in Ukraine, they're derailing the trains. In Belarus, they're just blowing up the tracks, which the Germans can replace in record time. And so
Mhm.
that is not how you're supposed to be waging. So that was one of his big accusations that they are not waging the right type of partisan war. And yeah, I would love a for someone, either a chapter or for someone to do a good study about these or this infighting among the Soviets during the war and after when it comes to the memory of the partisan war, because that becomes very important for reputations.
Sure.
That's how you sustain yourself to a large extent in terms of what you did during the war.
Hmm.
But okay, I mean that's an important aspect that I was glad to have a chapter in my volume on from Ken Slepian. He has his big
Yeah.
argument that this is very much an example of a civil war, which I don't necessarily consider, but absolutely that is exactly what it was. It was almost a continuation of what you saw during the Russian Revolution and the aftermath of it in the Civil War. Um, Now, I will say that you do have, combat in the subtitle. There's undoubtedly combat being discussed, but it's not, I would argue, correct me if I'm wrong, the traditional sense that I think of operational histories is you've got these battles, you've got the maneuvers, you've got the units, divisions, commanders, weapons, etc. That is not so much at the center of the vast majority of the chapters here. And so I'm wondering, and I'm not against that being at the center or not. But I'm wondering if you are seeing something of a move away from those traditional operational histories, a la Glantz, Jonathan House, and some
Hmm.
others that we've seen dominate the operational history field when it comes to the Eastern Front, and kind of a more of a move towards social, cultural, ideological aspects of the war.
Yeah, well, I do think that in academic circles, operational history is not viewed as an overly exciting or challenging type of history. And I would disagree. I just think of the work of Dave Sahel in the past 10 years, who, and he contributed a chapter to this volume. And it's not pure operational history, but it is operational history. And he's completely revised the way we understand Operation Barbarossa, which, in my opinion, is maybe the most consequential military operation of the 20th century. So I do think that there is a place for operational history. I'm not sure operational history is written by academics anymore. I mean, if you go to any bookstore, there's a ton of operational history from the American Civil War up through World War I, especially the Second World War. But I think most of it is written by popular historians. That the Academy has kind of ceded that ground in a way. Um, and this is not, I'm not bemoaning the fact, this is just the way that things have shifted. And we see this in historiography all the time. And no matter what field you're in, things change. But, Dave Stahel's chapter in the book, he looks at Hitler's retreat, or the Hitler's halt order and the retreat in front of Moscow. And, something that everyone, if you look at any book written in the last, you know, 60 years on the Second World War, something that's been accepted that Hitler's halt order was a good thing. Well, Dave went in, took a look at the files, and like, no, actually, it wasn't, and that the Army really suffered because of it and worked strenuously to get around it. And it's a fantastic chapter, and it does show us, I think, that there is still real value in looking at operational history. That we can find new things out, that all these questions aren't settled. Um, Now, the other works in here that I think get into military history. I think my contribution does when I look at the scorched earth retreats. I think Adrian Betstein's does with the twin retreats from Kharkiv. This is military history as it's evolved, I think.
Mhm.
That it's at a lower level and it's looking at not just the battles, but putting the battles into a larger context of occupation, of treatment of enemy civilians, of economic issues, and to try to put it all together into one overarching view of things, as opposed to looking just at battles. So I do think military history has evolved in that way. And of course, David Harrisfield's volume on the German army is military history in its own way, right? A social history of trying to understand why the German army fought the war that it did, the way it justified itself to its men. And I think Nick Virtue's chapter fits into this, one on Italy. Yeah, he looks at, some of the campaigns that they're involved in, but that's not the main focus. The main focus is how Italian soldiers kind of interacted with the Soviet civilians around them. So I would agree that operational it's operational history is I don't believe it's encouraged much in academia, but I do think there's a place for it. There's Rob Citino wrote 4 outstanding volumes on the German army in the Second World War. That kind of stuff's important. Stephen Fritz wrote a great book that looked at operational history and occupation and combined it into one, looking at German policy in the East. And if you're going to look at the war, you got to look at the fighting, don't you? I mean, that's the basis of the war. Everything else is built around that. Without the fighting, then we don't have everything else. So I think the way that the historical profession has evolved, the way military history has evolved, it's looking at how battles fit into the larger context of what countries are trying to do, how they're trying to do it, and the effects that they have, as opposed to just looking at armies on their own, doing their own thing.
Yeah, I that's been my impression as well. You're spot on. Academia is not necessarily the safest place for those who want to do operational history. You're also right in that David Stahl's his volumes,
Mm,
Barbarossa and beyond, have all, yeah, have really made me reconsider what I know, and that happens very rarely, considering how much literature is out there already. So for him to
hmm
come out and continue to do that, and you're right, he did it with his first book on Operation Barbarossa. I
hmm
think he did it again with this chapter, which I think is part of a larger work
Yes.
that he did when it comes to the retreat.
Yep.
outside of Moscow in 1941. And so it's taking the traditional operational history approach, but as you said, it's expanding it. It's adding a lot of nuance and context that there's much more to warfare than just the fighting, than just the
Hmm.
orders, than just the maneuvers. You do have to take into account occupation policy, logistics, food provisioning, scorched earth, retreats. All of this has to answer the conversation. Coalition warfare,
Hmm.
all of this that is so easily overlooked when you just have this myopic view of, all right, he moved here, then he moved there, then we took the city. That's not really the war as it
Right.
evolved on the Eastern Front. And
Yeah,
so,
it's not a chessboard.
yeah.
Um, but I do think we've almost moved too far in the other direction where we have so much written about the war, without the actual combat and the actual fighting. And I do think that there has to be some happy medium
Mhm.
where we see the way that battlefield events interact with um, other aspects of the war. Because I think it's all part of the same thing, and it's almost an artificial division to pull them apart.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't want to. And I think again, David's is a good example of somebody who walks that line,
Hmm.
as is yours, your work on the Eastern Front or the German army in general. Even my own work, right? I approached this 20 plus years ago. I was reading operational histories, and that was my bread and butter. And I
Hmm.
slowly moved away from it into collective memory representations, individual memory versus collective memory. And so that has been the lens through which I analyze the Second World War, even though I still have a lot of interest in the operational histories, the battles, the maneuvers, including the numerous quote unquote forgotten
Yeah,
campaigns on the Eastern Front, which are probably too many to name.
yeah.
And that's a whole other aspect of the Eastern Front that one day I hope we have more information on once the archives are open again, but who knows when that will happen. And
No,
so,
I think that's a really good point that you make. That uh, we have, I think, Operation Barbarossa. We have a really good sense of what's going on. There's been a ton of work on the ideological aspect, on the military aspect, on the Soviet response. And then you get in 1942, all right, Stalingrad's pretty well covered. We have a good sense of that. 43, Kursk. 44, we're getting into the Soviet offensive there against Army Group Center. We're starting to get that. But that's a huge front where combat is pretty constant throughout the entirety of the war. And filling in those gaps might tell us a lot of things we don't know. So I do think there's still a lot of dissertations and a lot of work that could be done on the fighting in these areas, and I do think it would give us a much fuller picture of the war.
yeah, even so, let's go back now that you've kind of started this conversation, right? With
Sure.
1941, it's mostly oriented on the German victories, and
Yes.
very rarely do you hear, right? The Red Army retakes Rostov in the south. That's
Hmm.
almost a blip on the radar. There is
Hmm.
the minor tactical victory at the Yelnya by Zhukov, which
Hmm.
then designates the first guards units in the Red Army. It was a bit of a bloodbath, and it served a kind of morale boosting purpose. Not much beyond that. The Germans are still on the move right after. But you also, in the immediate aftermath or during the Moscow counteroffensive, you've got the evolution of the counteroffensive along the entirety of the front and
Hmm.
the Demyansk pocket in the north, I think in
Hmm.
February, which we do not have as much information about. And this is the catalyst for the airlift at Stalingrad. Speaking of Stalingrad, you have the entire North Caucasus campaign going on,
Yep.
which you hear so little about.
Yep.
And there were more troops down there than in and around Stalingrad, and more casualties, perhaps. So there's still so much that does not have the attention that it needs. Not to speak of the occupation, what is
Hmm.
happening in occupied territory, what is happening on the home front at the same.
Hmm.
So yeah, there's still so many studies left to be done by future scholars. One can only hope we have the time and the resources.
Resources, yeah, that's the key. One thing you brought this up, and you said that operational history was kind of your entryway
Yeah.
into the war. And so, I teach undergrads, and I've taught a course on the Second World War for 18 years now. And what I find is that there's always a handful and across classes, maybe 8 or 9, 10 young men generally who are into the battles, right? Really, really like the battles. Um, and I do think that the battles are a way to get people in to start thinking about other things,
Mhm.
and that maybe operational history isn't in vogue right now, but I do think it is an entryway for a lot of people into studying the Second World War. And then, yeah, you read about it and then you're like, ooh, well, this is kind of interesting. And you move off in a different direction. So for me, I was the same way, occupation or operational history, but now I'm really interested in occupation and how the Army interact there. You're into, you were in operations and it was into memory and myth making. And I think this is kind of normal. I was talking with David Harrisville about this. Same thing. He was really into, tanks and their use and how they're used on the battlefield. And he just wrote a brilliant study on the German army and its understanding of morality. So I do think operational history is both important for understanding the war as a whole, but also for keeping the historical profession and people interested in history refreshed.
Mhm.
That this continues to bring in people who are interested in the war, and then they go and, merge off in different directions.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a weird fetish and love affair with battles, bullets, and blood.
Mhm. Yeah,
But at the very least, it gets them hooked into it, and then yeah, you go on to figure out what else interests you about the
yeah,
war. Um,
exactly.
and so this kind of long-ranging, wide-ranging conversation about the Eastern Front really delves us or allows us to delve into your introduction, which I think you did a fantastic job with
Thank
into
you.
diving into this recent literature on the Eastern Front and critically from both the Soviet and the German point of view. And so, thinking about kind of this larger arena of the Eastern Front, one, can you shed a little more light about the process of writing the introduction? Did you discover anything new and interesting? But at the same time, and you've named now numerous chapters from this volume, do you have a select few favorite? It's hard to do, right? To just pick a few. And at the same time, I think you've also touched on this, but did any really challenge your understanding of the Eastern Front, right? Did any give you kind of a moment of aha, that for all the years you've been studying this topic, this is something new and fascinating and very much worthwhile?
Mhm. Well, let me start with the introduction. So that was not the original introduction, and this gets into the nuts and bolts of doing something like this. One of the reviewers very much thought the first introduction was good, set this tone for the book. The other reviewer did not, and made some suggestions as how to rewrite it. So I took those suggestions and decided to turn into kind of an overview of the historiography of the war. Uh, Obviously, I'm I'm looking at my approach to the war is from the German perspective, so I had a fairly good grip on that historiography, able to use English language historiography. Um, Had to really work at figuring out the various stages and phases and what books were important in Soviet and Russian languages historiography. But one of the claims that I made in the introduction was that the Second World War's most defining war was the German-Soviet War. Uh, I think I mentioned this earlier. If we look at the historiography of the Second World War as a whole, especially in the West, for the first, 40 years after the Second World War, the British and the Americans won the war. And Cold War Soviets are just, they died a lot. We don't have to worry about them. And then I think the 90s, as archives start to open, David Glantz, who you've mentioned, Jonathan House, they get in there, they start churning out works, and Glantz churns out works. We get a sense of just the scale of the fighting in the East from the Soviet side. Um, and whereas a lot of the German-centric stuff is really strong on 41 and 42, not surprisingly, operations kind of tail off as we get past Kursk and 44 and 45. We don't know a lot because the Germans who were writing their memoirs didn't want to talk about the defeats all that much. So we got much more information from the Soviet side there. And this helped round out our view of the war. So what I wanted to do was kind of break it down into phases of historiography, going from the operational to the ideological, going from looking at, the field marshals and the generals to how do average soldiers understand what's going on in the war. So that was the point of that. I wanted to look at the military stuff, but I think part of what makes this such the defining struggle of the Second World War was the violence, and I think here the ideology is very important. And I think this ideology operates at two levels. Of course, you have just a simple Nazi belief that the Soviet territory is going to be the land of milk and honey for Germany, that they deserve it because they're racially superior and they can destroy Judeo-Bolshevism and conquer and rule over this racial empire. So you have this ideological venom coming from the Nazis, which really informs 1941, and of course remains consistent throughout the war. But I think there's the other really important ideology that we have here is nationalism, and that a book edited by Bartov and Weitz, Shattered Zone of Empires, where it looks at where the Austro-Hungarian, the Russian, and the Ottoman empires all kind of crash into each other and then dissipate, um, as well as the way that well, the bloodlands, right? If we want to use Schneider's language, this whole strip is filled with various ethnic groups who are all kind of working at their cross purposes, right? Working for their own benefit. And you mentioned this earlier, right? Hungary and Romania battling it out while on the same side, ostensibly, right? Fighting with the Germans. So that there was something here that I thought needed to be looked at, that the violence unleashed by the German-Soviet War is also very localized by various groups fighting for various things. Sometimes these ideas overlap with the Germans. So, as you mentioned, those Ukrainian militia who assist the Germans in carrying out the Holocaust in that part of the world. You could talk about the same thing in Lithuania, right? That this idea of creating these ethnically homogenous states. And I think what the irony of one of the ironies of the German invasion is that instead of having this massive racial empire in the East, we have a bunch of ethnically homogenous states created by violence unleashed by the Nazis and local nationalists, and then finished by the Soviets when they carry out massive population exchanges in those areas and wage their own kind of counterinsurgency after the war against nationalist groups. So I thought it was important to look at all of that, because I think this is what makes the German-Soviet War so violent, so important for the 20th century. The battlefield stuff it's a scale that's unimaginable in the West. The size of the armies and the bloodletting on both sides, but it's the local stuff, which the Germans and the Soviets are involved with, but all sorts of other peoples are playing an important role in what's going on. And I think when you roll all this together into the German-Soviet War, you get a sense of why, at least I thought it was the most defining conflict of the Second World War.
Absolutely. And so looking at, thinking again about the chapters, did any of them challenge your understanding?
Um, let's see. I really liked, I will start here by saying I think all the chapters are really good. I think they all add something to the story. The last two by Travis Gray and Ian Garner, looking at the rebuilding of Smolensk and Stalingrad, but from very different perspectives, I think show both the dreams and reality of what the Soviets are trying to do, and then what they actually can do pragmatically, but also the way that Stalingrad in particular is utilized as a myth for post-war Soviet Union. I guess if a couple chapters that really stand out, Ed Westerberg's chapter on Holocaust in Latvia, I think is outstanding. He does a really good job of using this idea of center versus periphery. And in Holocaust studies, this generally means Berlin versus those in the field. And what Ed has identified is, well, we have a couple centers and a couple peripheries, and that we have Berlin, but we have civilian power, the Gauleiter in Istland, and then we have the SS, who are kind of doing their own thing out in small villages, and that the periphery isn't responding to the center. But then the question is, who is the center? So I think Ed's chapter is fantastic, and I know that every class that I teach on the Holocaust going forward, that will be assigned, because I think it really gets at the power dynamics and the confusion that we see within the Nazi leadership. They all kind of agree on the same thing, same end goal, but how to get there, I think is hasn't been formulated in 1941. Maris Rowe McCullough's chapter on Soviet POWs, I think, is excellent. We have a fair amount of information on the fate that befell Soviet POWs, the tragic fate that befell Soviet POWs. You make a good case that this is a genocide under German control, but a lot of that is based on German records. And especially the focus is on 41, 42, because this is when we have that period of mass death, starvation. Maris goes a little later in 42, and she does it from the Soviet perspective, utilizing Soviet sources. She certainly uses German sources as well, but I think what makes her chapter so interesting is the use of Soviet sources. At least in English language historiography, we don't have a lot of the voices of Soviet POWs and the horrendous fate that they underwent. So I think her chapter is excellent. Nick Virtue's chapter I've mentioned on Italy, I think, is another really good one. That we know something about Italy in 42. Well, this extends it, and also lets us think about the idea of the Vernichtungskrieg and how important it is to Germany's allies. Susan Grunewald, she wrote an excellent book on German POWs in the Soviet Union, and her chapter does a really good job. I think most people think of German POWs as being ideologically brainwashed, and they're there because the Soviets want to punish them. And Susan shows, nope. What they're doing is they need somebody to rebuild the country, right? To rebuild with Smolensk and Stalingrad that Travis and Ian talk about. The other chapter that I think is really, really good is Adrian Bettstein's. He looks at two different German retreats from Kharkiv in 1943. And what he shows is that the Germans are learning lessons during these retreats. And I think this is a type of the new military history that is a very military focused chapter looking at this is what levels of command are involved, this is what they're trying to do, and this is what they do. But what he's showing is, all right, when they end up back in there and then they have to retreat again, how do they do it differently? What have they learned? And this plays into larger issues of economics. This plays into mobilization of manpower, both for the Germans and the Red Army. I think it's an excellent chapter getting at how armies learn. And there's been a lot of that type of literature, especially about the First World War, armies on learning curves. Here we see the German army on the learning curve, not in fighting, but in retreating. And well, that's what the Germans are going to do for the next 2 years. So it is important that they kind of think about this. And I think Adrian does a really good job of bringing out this whole process and how they carry it out.
Yeah, you've identified a few that I was also I considered some of the stronger chapters for sure. Ed's, I found it interesting because you do have, when you look at authoritarian regimes, these competing power structures, and you see that on a ground level here. And it also points to your own work, which is the German army is a competing power structure when it comes to resources on the Eastern Front.
For
And
sure.
it very much works together. And at the same time, you also see the kind of agency that the cogs in the system have, like
Yeah.
these people on the ground not so much making decisions in Berlin or somewhere in occupied territory, but literally are the ones who are carrying out those orders and have the power of life and death at their fingertips.
And that's just it, right? That Berlin can issue orders, field marshals, army group commanders can issue orders. Somebody's got to carry them out. And how do they carry them out? What do they see as the way their scope for action? What's limiting them that it's not understood at the Army group or Army level. Yeah, I think you're exactly right that this is the key. How do these things happen at the local level?
Yeah, so extremely useful for our understanding of the Eastern Front. Similarly, those voices that we so rarely hear from in terms of POWs. Similarly, I think of the foreign workers, right? Foreign Eastern workers
Yep.
that are taken to Germany that we rarely hear about their experiences. Most recently, Return to the Motherland by Seth Bernstein does a really good job of
Hmm.
discussing their experiences, both while being taken to Germany, experiences in Germany, experiences as displaced persons, and then experiences in the Soviet Union when they were repatriated and how they're viewed by their colleagues at work, by kind of neighbors in their neighborhoods or cities, and how they carry this taboo of what happened with them during the war, kind of like a scarlet letter uh,
Yeah.
in the post-war period. And similarly, honestly, POWs also had some of the same experiences, those that survived, which is so difficult for us to fathom. And finally, what you mentioned in terms of the chapter on the retreats from Kharkov, it reminded me of a one of the works by Michael Jones that he discusses when the German army is retreating. At one point, one of their ideas is to take a bunch of typhus infected victims and let the Red Army liberate them, not knowing what exactly is happening there, so they could affect them in theory and cripple the Red Army's advance. Similarly, poisoning alcohol in various places, because we definitely have evidence and testimony of Red Army soldiers either breaking into various um, establishments that had alcohol and dying from alcohol poisoning, or just being poisoned by what was left behind. So I think you're absolutely right in that there is an evolution to how the German army retreats over the years and what they
Mhm.
start to utilize. In what we can never forget is the closest that I think we've come to total war, right, as a country.
I I would agree 100%. That's kind of the theme for the book I'm working on right now is that the way the German army fights this war is that they think of it as a total war in every way, and that the emphases change over time, but yeah, that's how they think about it. And one of the chapters in the book, Boss Willem's chapter on the German army is retreating to East Prussia. That here, he shows that a lot of things that they were doing in the Soviet Union, but they just can't turn it off when they
Mhm.
cross that border, and that these routines and patterns continue to determine German action, even when they're on German territory. Right? This has become a total war in the German mind, and this is the only way that they know how to fight it by this point.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's a larger conversation of what it means to deploy military in your own territory,
Hmm.
uh, especially after they've now waged 3 to 4 years of grueling warfare on the Eastern Front.
Hmm.
And granted, not all of them might have been survived from 1941. Few of them, in many ways,
Right.
did, but the experiences are still there and carried out and carried on. Um,
Hmm.
and that was also definitely one of the more interesting chapters because that's not something that I've had too much exposure to. Thinking about, I know the retreats happen. I know that there's tons of propaganda about the Red Army and what to expect.
Hmm.
The fact that the mentality that the Wehrmacht has now assumed from their experiences on the Eastern Front is being translated into what they're doing on their own territory.
Hmm.
That I think is new and original and does add
Hmm.
a lot to our understanding. So excellent. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks, John. It was a good conversation.
All right.